Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of the Asian Pacific American Medical Student Association podcast. From roundtable discussions of current health topics to recaps of our panels with distinguished leaders in the healthcare field to even meeting current student leaders within the organization. This is White Coats and Rice. My name is Alton Tong, an M2 at the Boonshaw School of Medicine at Wright State University and a member of the National Leadership Committee at APAMSA. I'll be your host for today. This is our Ask Me Anything series. Each month, we spotlight an extraordinary physician who shares their insights on medicine, life, and everything in between. This is your chance to ask questions, hear their stories, and learn from their incredible experiences. Whether you're curious about their journey, their day-to-day, or their views on the future of medicine, nothing is off the table. Let's dive in. But tonight, we have a very special guest, Dr. Jhemon Lee, who is the Department Chair of Diagnostic Imaging at UCI Health, Los Alamitos. Now, Dr. Lee obtained his medical degree from the University of Maryland before completing radiology residency at the University of Chicago and fellowship in abdominal imaging at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School in Boston. But not only is he a practicing physician, but he's actually one of the co-founders of APAMSA. And he's been involved in building this organization from the ground up and has seen it grow into what it is today. So tonight we'll get a chance to hear about his journey through medicine, his role in starting APAMSA, and how his improv comedy gigs keep him laughing through it all. So it's a real honor to have him here to share his story. And welcome, Dr. Lee.
Hey there. Hi, everyone.
So, Dr. Lee, could you just first tell us a little bit about where you're calling in from and where you're currently based?
I'm in Southern California. I'm in Los Alamitos, California, which, if you know, Southern California, it's right on the border between LA County and Orange County, kind of where the 605 freeway meets the 405 freeway. It's like south of Cerritos, like north of Seal Beach, east of Long Beach, west of Cypress. Again, this is if you know Southern California. If you don't, it's basically, it's sort of in the suburbs of the LA area. And yeah, I'm at work right now. Originally, this call was supposed to be scheduled when I was done with work at 5. I guess there was a clerical error, so I'm actually officially on duty. So hopefully they don't call me while this happens.
Dream location? Is this, is this kind of somewhere you kind of unexpectedly ended up?
Well, I don't think we ever unexpectedly end up anywhere. As a physician, if you don't interview somewhere, you're not going to go there. So obviously I must have had some intent in coming out here. I'm originally from the DC area, and then, I went to school in Boston and Baltimore, Chicago. And, I wanted to try something different when I actually finished my fellowship. And so I said, let's go to the West Coast. And, I interviewed out here and decided let's come out to LA. And here I am. I've been here now for 25 years. So yeah, evidently I can't hate it too much, right?
Absolutely not. I mean, to go from coast to coast, especially throughout where medicine's taking you, I think it speaks volumes to kind of maybe just how your values and just, your experiences kind of shaped you over time, which we'll definitely dive into. But another question I wanted to ask, and that I think a lot of our folks wanted to ask, was just kind of what does your typical day in your professional life look right now? And, what kind of practice or clinical work are you doing these days?
A whole bunch of imaging studies. X-rays, CAT scans, MRIs, mammograms, nuclear medicine, PET CT, ultrasounds. And kind of at a very simplistic level, it's basically me sitting in front of a computer and basically looking at images all day. I am at the Women's Imaging Center, and I've been, I've done mammography and women's imaging for years, but I think I've been primarily at this site, the women's imaging section. Historically, it's because the pandemic happened, and the other people that did mammography, they all had small kids. So during the pandemic, they had to basically be at home to babysit. And I don't have kids. So then they were like, well, could you sort of be at the Women's Imaging Center since you have to be on site to do breast procedures. And also at our Women's Imaging Center, we actually talk to patients about the results of their diagnostic mammograms or breast ultrasound. So you have to be on site for that. And in a way, it's kind of fortuitous because I have to admit, I was kind of getting a little burned out of just sitting in front of computers all day and just reading one study after another. So I actually kind of liked the fact that I could break up, the sessions by actually talking to patients about the results. I never thought I would actually like that, but I actually did like that. And I think one thing about medicine is that sometimes you'll be surprised about how your practice will evolve. If you told me, when I was a resident, that someday I'd be doing primarily mammography, I would have laughed and said, no, there's no way I'd ever do that, But here I am, and I like it.
So it kind of sounds like, you've gone through a lot of change, geographically, but even just medically in your own kind of career and your trajectory, right? It sounds like a lot of life things have kind of moved you towards that. Since we're kind of on the topic of just your journey in medicine, maybe you could like walk us through it a little bit in terms of, we talked about where you went to medical school, but just how you kind of ended up where you currently are.
You mean in terms of like why I became a doctor kind of thing, or like how far back are we going?
Yeah, I mean, as far as like, how committed were you to medical school? Was it something you're always, determined about? And then just about your journey, like going through DC and then all the way to Southern California.
Way back when I was like 5, my parents said you should be a doctor, and like classic Asian parents, like we want you to be a doctor or a lawyer or engineer. But my dad was an engineer, so he didn't want me to be an engineer because he hated being an engineer, and he was worried that my verbal skills were strong enough to be a lawyer. So doctor it was, And I didn't think of anything else I wanted to do, so here I am. I mean, that said, being a doctor, being a physician, I think is a really good choice. There's it gives you a lot of options in life. It's very secure. All the things your Asian parents wanted for you, which is kind of like secure, successful, respectable, and all that stuff. And these things are true. But I do think it's also a very gratifying field because you get to actually help people just by doing your work. I think there are other jobs in this world where you're not actually helping people, or you may actually be kind of hurting people. But this is a good job, and I never really thought of something else I wanted to do. And it is something where if you're kind of academically or sort of intellectually oriented, it's a good choice, But here I am, So I was always kind of on the pre-med track. Like at college, I went to Harvard for undergrad. I was an engineering major, but that's just because I was good at that kind of stuff. But I was always pre-med, and I went to med school. And, I remember my first week of med school, like one of the fourth-year med students came in and looked around my room and said, you know what, I think you're going to be a radiologist. And I'm like, really? What makes you think that? And he says, no, I can tell. Probably because I had all these like technical posters up on the wall, so, very, very sure of technical things. So it's like, okay, yeah, and here I am, I try, they always say that you shouldn't overcommit to a specialty choice right off the bat. And I think that's true. You should keep an open mind about what you want to do because you may change your mind. I kind of thought it'd be radiology, especially since I was an engineering major. And it was the right choice for me. Not as much because of the engineering part. I think when you look around at a lot of the radiologists, a lot of them are not necessarily computer savvy or, say engineering types, but, some are. And what the thing I like about radiology is that it's definitely a very analytical kind of field. It's the kind of field where you can sort of analyze things and, you have time to think about things. It's not like some other fields, like say ER or surgery, where things can get very catastrophic right away, and you have to be able to make split-second decisions. And I think in my case, even with the most dire of circumstances, I still have at least a little bit of time to think about what I'm saying. So I do like that. I like that puzzle-solving aspect as well. College is a good fit for me. Not for everybody, but it's a good fit for me, though.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like it's funny when you were talking about earlier how your parents kind of gave you, it's like the one of 3 career choices, right? I kind of think of like that maybe our generation knows now, especially if it's like you start that first Pokemon game and it's like you have one of 3 starter Pokemon. It's like that, right? You're kind of just doing those choices, and those are the classic 3. I feel like in our Asian upbringings. But I was wondering if you could actually talk a little bit more about just your geographical location. Like I'm someone who actually also spent some time in Ellicott City, so I'm sure you're very familiar with the DMV area, and I loved it. But it kind of sounds like you bounced around, right? Like you started in the DMV, and then you went to college up in Boston, spent some time in the Midwest in Chicago, and then returned back, and then only to go all the way to the other side. Like, could you just tell us a little bit about that? How that was for you?
If you asked me in 11th grade where I was going to go for college, I would have said like University of Maryland, state school, because that's kind of where my dad wanted me to go. But then my granddad got involved, and he said, I have grandkids that went to Stanford, but none of them have gone to Harvard. It'd be great if you went to Harvard. And that was the one thing that sort of convinced my dad to let me at least apply there. I guess my grades were good enough, so I guess, it's like, so I went up there. And I think the nice thing is that I think if you stay in one place, like if I'd stayed in Maryland, I think I would have stayed in the DC area for the rest of my life. Because kind of like your universe is that area. But, once you actually go away, suddenly your universe is bigger. And then you're open to like, oh, okay, I did just like, it was actually nice going somewhere else. So maybe where else can I go? I did go back to Baltimore because, that's against school, cheaper that way. But after that, it's like, yeah, let me try a different city. And, when I was looking for residencies, I looked all over the place. And University of Chicago was one of my top choices. And I went there and, again, went back to Boston. But after that, it's like I really just wanted to try something different. Sometimes from a personal standpoint, we make decisions. Like it's not just is not just about, like, say, going to the absolute best training program in the nation. Sometimes it's also a matter of like, well, where do I want to live? I mean, this is not meant to be a ding. I remember that when I was in med school, I did apply to Johns Hopkins, which is a top-notch school. And I remember thinking, like, other people interviewing here, they're going to rank it first. They said that up front, that I'm going to rank Hopkins first. And I'm like, I'm not going to rank it first. I really want to get out of Baltimore. So, sometimes that is part of the equation. Where do you want to live for 4 years as a resident, And likewise, when you get your first job, it may be different if you're in academics, by the way, because in academics, you want to go wherever sometimes you want to go where your career opportunities are best. But, if you're doing private practice, you do have to weigh the options, which is like, for example, I remember when I came out of fellowship, I had different choices. I could live in Southern California and make X amount, or I could live in a different city, like, I don't know, like Indiana, make this amount. Money is relevant, but, kind of like you have to live there. So sometimes it's kind of like you sort of make that decision choice, like, well, if I make X amount to live in LA or live in New York or someplace like that, but I can make more if I live in, like, say, I know, some other place that's less desirable, which is more important to you, And like, I want to live in the place I want to live. And the funny thing about Southern California is that, like, everyone thinks about the beaches and the weather. That's not really as important to me. What I really like about this area is how diverse it is. Diversity of people, diversity of cultures, diversity of food, So it's like, it's nice,
As someone who spent some time in Southern California, in Orange County and San Diego, I very much resonate with what you're saying. It's kind of like a place where you can get what you want, right? And there's access to everything and everywhere. And there's so many beautiful cultures, people of just different, ethnicities, backgrounds, upbringings, who just all come together. And that's really the beautiful thing. And I think we're kind of seeing that hopefully in other areas too, right? As we kind of, as our world and stuff progresses, I'm hoping that can be more of a reality for other places as well. Since we're kind of on the topic of your private practice group, I wanted to ask, was private practice something that you always envisioned, or was it kind of something that just kind of came about?
I think it was something that kind of came about in the sense that, if, like, in fellowship, I was kind of convinced I was going to end up in academics. Not that I really, not like I'm a big researcher or anything like that, but I kind of like the academic kind of, like, you're teaching, you're on the cutting edge of things and so forth. So I interviewed at a number of academic places, but I mean, just to round it out, I did interview at a couple of private practice places, and kind of like halfway through my interviews, I kind of had an epiphany, which is, again, like a matter of prioritizing what's important to you. And, kind of personality-wise, I said, I like academics, but at least at that time, private practice made twice as much money as academics. So I'm like, well, money is not that important to me, but at the same time, if I flip it around, relative to private practice, do I like academics enough to take a 50% pay cut? And I'm like, I don't like it that much, So that was kind of why I'm like, maybe I should do academics, again, because, if the salaries were the same, I would do academics. But, this much of a difference, like, I don't like being an academician that much, So therefore I said, maybe I should do private practice then, Now, by the same token, as I said earlier, you make X amount in Montana, and you make X amount in LA, am I willing to go to LA for a 50% pay cut? And the answer is, okay, yes, I will do that. So my priorities, other people are like, no, give me the money, and I'd rather live out in where hunting and fishing is great, But that's what ended up happening, and it's practical realities. I think idealistically, we should do absolutely what we want to do, and I think for a lot of people, academics is absolutely the right choice. But sometimes these practical considerations come in also, and it's okay. It's okay to say, what, I do want to make more money, or it's okay to say I want to work less, or I want to live in a certain area.
Yeah, I think, obviously as someone in medical school now, I always feel that we always think we want to do academia just because we've literally just grew up in it, right? That's how we get our training. That's just what we're kind of honestly born into, right? And that's just the only world that we know. And to be honest, like, I think, I can only envision myself in an academic center, but as I talk to more and more physicians who've been in the field doing the work for so long, I realize that there's so much out there, right? Private practice, but there's also industry, pharmacy, and there's so many opportunities. Think about even just legislation stuff, right? There's so much that so many physicians can do. I think that's really a beautiful thing that we have. And so, one thing I really wanted to ask you was, you're essentially a radiologist, but you're also a business owner. So that's a lot to handle all at once. How do you balance the two?
I have to admit, I've been avoiding this the whole time. I've been a part of my radiology group for like 25 years, And like it wasn't until like about like a little maybe like a year like a year like a little maybe a year and a half ago where the last president left our group to go somewhere else. Like basically I was next in line, so I kind of had to take over. I mean, it's a very, very educational experience for me because, you're sort of dumped in the deep end of like, handling all the stuff like personnel stuff and like financial stuff and looking at the books. And I'd kind of looked at these things before. It's one thing if you're kind of like nodding along while other people are looking as well. But if you're the one who's now in charge of running the ship, you actually have to fully pay attention. You can't just coast on trusting someone else to do it. You have to do it yourself. It is hard. I think the hardest part about being president of a group, especially this is a small group, it's a small group of like 6 radiologists, is that you still have to do the work of a full-time radiologist on top of it. It may be different if you're president of a group that has like 80 physicians where they probably have allotted like, say, administrative time for you to do your administrative stuff. But for me, it's kind of like I got to pull the same weight as everyone else does, and plus I have to do all this admin stuff on top of it. So it is hard in that respect. Like I said, I've learned a lot, and I think this is true no matter what you do, is that as you progress in your career, be in academics or private practice or, as you say, pharma or anything else, like ideally, you're always going to be progressing and doing new things that are challenging you. And, this has definitely been a challenge. Like, for example, one of the biggest challenges right now is that there's a nationwide radiologist shortage, and our group is short staffed. So basically it's been like, I've had to learn how to like recruit, how to interview and how to try to convince people that, like, hey, come join us, stuff like that. So yeah, it's definitely a learning curve for this. It's not for everyone. And, honestly, I'm not sure for all of you, I'm not sure how many private practices will still be around because I think more and more there's consolidation with with large medical groups like sort of dominating the landscape, especially with private equity coming in and basically snapping up groups and creating these national networks where essentially doctors become employees, so like basically working for someone else, I think it's a challenge for our field, especially when we're working for corporations where the main motive is not helping people, but really just like making money.
You probably see this, honestly, truthfully, right, especially in Southern California, where a lot of the UCs are, they're essentially investing right into a lot of the local businesses, a lot of local hospitals, and for better or for worse. But I think we see a lot of that, and that always brings up another bag, right, of questions as to whether or not, physicians are happy, like what are the lifestyles become like that, and even just other things like day-to-day life within those systems. I think for our students and for aspiring entrepreneurs listening, they'd kind of like to know what advice you would give to someone who's curious about private practice.
Well, I think the easiest thing to do is to ask doctors, actually talk to doctors in private practice. Obviously, the majority of doctors are in private practice in one form or another. So, as a med student, you do have access to a lot of doctors, not just at the academic center. But, honestly, we all see doctors. It's like as patients, you see doctors. You could ask around, for example, if you want to know more about what life is like as a private practice anesthesiologist or pathologist or OBGYN, ask around, ask the academic attendings, like, hey, do you know people in private practice? I'd love to tap their brains about this, ask within APAMSA, we do have a network of alumni, and I know that, as an organization, we haven't quite exactly made made it super easy for med students to connect with the alumni, but eventually we'll do that. And, I think it's a great opportunity to sort of pick people's brains about what they like and what they don't like about their fields, and their practice situations. So it's also worth talking to someone about. Like, some people are perfectly happy actually working for one of those big mega corporations because then it's like, I just clock in and I clock out and I just sort of focus on care, during my shift. I don't have to worry about anything else afterwards. But other people want something else,
Right. So it's like the importance of continuously being inquisitive and curious about,
Yes.
what's on the horizons, essentially, right? Kind of what could my life potentially look like? I think that's important, and especially as you're talking about kind of expanding our network and just connecting students. That's one of the greatest things about the Ask Me Anything series, right? That we're currently on. This is our chance to ask you literally anything. So yeah, thanks for that.
Oh, I was going to say one thing is that even me interviewing like current residents and fellows, it's actually I learned stuff. Like our field is constantly evolving. So, whatever I know, like I think I know, but things keep on changing, so it's
Right.
a two-way street.
For sure. lifelong learner is what we always consider ourselves. I mean, I think that's so true. So Dr. Lee, you're not only diagnosing patients, but you're actually also delivering punchlines. Let's
Yes.
switch gears a little bit and let's talk about your improv comedy.
Like I've always liked the arts. I've always been a part of Asian American organizations, and that included going to, like, say, theaters in Los Angeles that sort of specialize in Asian Pacific American stories and acting and so forth. And I just wanted to kind of get more involved in that, just like left brain versus right brain kind of stuff. And I realized I didn't really have the time to do, like, at first I thought like maybe playwriting or stuff like that might be a fun hobby, but I realized I didn't have the time for that. So I just wanted to do something, and I basically got involved in an Asian American improv group, which is offering improv classes. If you know improv comedy is like, it's like Whose Line Is It Anyway? Where you throw out a suggestion and then you have to do something with it. You have to do a scene with it off the top of your head. No preparation, no homework, just do it. And it's been really fun to do that. And I've done it for a long time. And then when I met my wife, I got her involved in it as well. So that was a really fun activity for us to do for several years. Admittedly, we haven't done improv since the pandemic. It's kind of hard to do improv over Zoom. It's possible, but it's kind of much better when you get to do it with people. And I think the great thing about improv is that it definitely loosens you up. One of the key tenets of improv is to say yes to things. Like in real life, a lot of times someone will say something outlandish and you'll say no to it. But in improv, like, one of the key tenets is to embrace that, to embrace, the unknown, to embrace, crazy suggestions and explore it and so forth. And, to sort of say, whatever decision you make, it's a good decision, and let's go with it. And I think that's very freeing for someone who, in medicine, especially, with an Asian American upbringing, where it's kind of like, we're so regimented, we're afraid of making mistakes, that it's almost liberating to sort of get into the mindset of like, it's okay if you make a mistake, because when you make a mistake, it's kind of a different avenue that you can explore in your scene. So yeah, I think it's and I would say to everyone on the call, if you have a chance to do improv, I think it's fun. I think you'll learn a lot about yourself, about, thinking on your feet and so forth. But even if you don't do it, I think it's important to have hobbies outside of medicine, to do stuff that is completely different from medicine. It makes you a more well-rounded person, makes you a more interesting person. And I think the other aspect is you meet people from different walks of life. I do think that a lot of times as physicians, our friends, of course, a lot of our friends are going to be physicians as well. So then it becomes almost like an echo chamber where we just sort of keep on bouncing the same complaints off of one another. It's sometimes really good to talk to people from a completely different walk of life. Like in my improv class, there are a lot of actors, and there are a lot of things that we take for granted as physicians. Like here's a really good example. I remember that as a radiology resident, like in my residency, like I would take call like every 10th night. And you know what? You tell that to anyone in any other field, and they'll just laugh at you, right? You tell the person in P's residency or the person in internal medicine residency, they're on call Q3, Q4, Q5, right? And they're like, okay, you have it easy. If I talk to someone who's not in medicine, they're like, oh my God, that's terrible. It's like, okay, thanks. So sometimes it's nice to really get other people's perspective. It also gives you appreciation for things that we take for granted. Like, as a physician, I have a steady job. I can pay my mortgage. You talk to actors, they never know where the next gig is. It's hard for them to think about a mortgage because acting is so haphazard. You can strike it rich if you end up on a really big TV program. Or for most people, they're going to hundreds of auditions just to book one gig,
One of our questions that we have from the chat is, what'd you do to get better with the yes and type of mentality? Could you share some of your favorite improv memories as well?
What are my favorite improv memories? What do you do to get better at this? Basically, just to sort of accept it. Like when you take improv classes, they often start with some really basic, simple exercises. Like one-line stories, it's like we don't really have time to sort of do all the improv stuff, here. But they start with really basic exercises that seem really simple, but it's kind of to sort of get you like out of your usual constrained thinking mode and to kind of free you up a little bit, And, I think what's really important is that you do it with a set of other people that are supportive of one another, where, you're playing improv games, and as long as the other people are roll with it, and you support one another, I think this is probably true, not just in improv, but I think in life in general. It really helps when you're working with people, interacting with people to support one another, that makes life a lot easier as opposed to just everyone nitpicking. Because, improv, there's like right and wrong. Like in improv, the right choices are the choices that are more interesting, that are more fun for the audience to watch. Those are right. But again, like there's no right or wrong per se. There may be choices that are more entertaining or less entertaining. But I think what is really good in improv is that when you're with a group of supportive teachers and classmates, that even when you pick maybe a less entertaining choice, that no one gets on your case about it. I think that frees you up to make those bolder choices. When you're not afraid right. Because someone's supporting you.
That importance of having that support system that kind of empower you to encourage you really to explore more, right? And I think, since we have you on, especially speaking of just having that supportive system, I know for me, selfishly, I think APAMSA for me has been one of that opportunity, right? Where you're able to connect with other people of honestly pretty similar backgrounds, similar interests, and obviously similar hopes and dreams. And you're obviously a co-founder of APAMSA. So I think, we just naturally have to ask, how'd you come about co-founding APAMSA? Like, was there an aha moment? And when did you kind of realize the need for it?
Well, sometimes it's kind of just being in the right place at the right time, to be honest. Like I've always, like in college and in med school, I was always involved in local, like, Asian American groups. And I was always surprised that there wasn't like at that, like when I was, and, I was a med student from like 1990 to 1994. And I was always surprised that there wasn't some sort of national, Asian Pacific American medical student group. Because, you have like, Latinx and African American groups that like SNMA, for example, that are out there. And why isn't there an Asian one? And of course, the answer is always because, well, you're not an underrepresented minority. But, even though like, APIs are not underrepresented, there still are unique challenges for being an API med student. And, the API communities also have the unique challenges as well. So I remember that way back when, I did, for example, like I knew someone who was an officer at AMSA, American Medical Student Association, and he said that, well, maybe there's some movement to have like a Asian students section within like I forget what it's called, the Minority Affairs. I forget the name of the acronym, but within AMSA there's a Minority Affairs section, and I guess like the other minorities weren't really interested in APIs having their section in AMSA just because they felt that they wanted to focus on underrepresented minorities. But kind of within that, you're talking to other people, organizers, and they pointed me to B. Lee, who, I think many of you are familiar with as well because he goes to the conventions every year. And, he was trying to start something nationally. There have been multiple other attempts in the past to create some sort of national API medical student network. But in the past, it was really hard because if you think about before the early 90s, how did you communicate with people who weren't at your school? Because they didn't have email back then. I mean, there was email, but it was only like really nerdy people who had access. Like I was an engineering major. So like I knew how to use email, but, most people didn't have access. So back then you had to either handwrite letters and mail it, or you had to get onto the phone back in the days when it cost like $2 a minute for long distance. I know this is foreign to all of you. Back in the old days, we had rotary phones, and no, I'm kidding. No, we did have some rotary phones back then. But at any rate, it was so expensive and difficult. But then in the early 90s, people were starting to get email. I think that was the key. That, I think B leveraged off of that and created an email list server for API med students. And that was a way to connect med students from across the country. And I got involved in that. He actually organized an organizational meeting to see if we could create an actual organization off of this. And perchance, he was hosting it at his home at Columbus, Ohio, because back then he was a professor at Ohio State University. And it happened that weekend, the weekend that he was putting it together, was the weekend that I graduated from med school. I was driving from DC to Chicago from med school to residency. And just happened that weekend, that's when the meeting was. And I was driving from point A to point B. And halfway there is Columbus, Ohio. So, hey, why not? So that's why I went. And pretty much I participated in that sort of organizational meeting. Then kind of like we all agreed that we would start an organization. We also had to decide where the first convention was. And of the people that were interested in the meeting, one guy didn't show up because it was too far away and he was in New York. So we all voted that he would be in charge of the first convention in New York since he wasn't the first to say no. So his name was John Cho, and I think at that point he said, "Okay, sure." And yeah, first national convention in New York in January 1995. Admittedly, I kind of dropped off at APAMSA for a couple of years because I felt at that point, as a resident, it didn't make sense for me to be a part of a med student organization as a resident. But then I got back involved in 1997 because I heard about the APAMSA convention in 1997, again in Ohio State that year, and that there was talk about maybe creating an advisory board. So I said, okay, maybe it would be great to get involved in something like that. So I got involved with the advisory board when it was first started in 1997. I got plugged back into APAMSA, and I've been a part of APAMSA's advisory board ever since then.
This is awesome to hear about, because I think especially, as times continue to change and quite frankly, technology, right, does its wonders. Talk about, email listserv kind of being the kind of like the vehicle, right, through which APAMSA was able to kind of grow. I think nowadays, like, there's so many social media channels, right, that quite frankly, that National APAMSA runs on, but just our whole society seems to run it. And again, for good or for bad. But I think that type of ability to kind of connect with other people throughout the world is something that's really special. And I think, you're one who's seen APAMSA literally grow from what it was just from the roots to what it is now. I think something that our audience is kind of interested in is kind of this question. There's so much going on in the world currently in terms of socially and politically. Where do you see APAMSA having the greatest potential for impact?
I think APAMSA, if you look at the mission, it's it's supporting API communities. It's supporting the professional development of API med students, and that's probably where APAMSA has the most impact. I mean, I think by serving API communities, that gives us a focus. But at the end of the day, where APAMSA makes the biggest difference is with all of you. That it's part of your experience as med students. Like, you're all students and you're learning how to be physicians, but APAMSA gives you a different perspective on the kinds of things that you can do as a doctor. It has more of a focus on serving the community. It gives you awareness of, like API health issues and so forth. And I think probably the biggest thing that's helpful is it gives you hand-on experience actually leading an organization, running an organization. When you do that at the local level, at the national level. And these are skills that translate to being a good physician someday, because someday in academics and private practice, wherever you go, you're going to be leading people. You're going to be directing staff members. You're going to be a part of your department or your company and trying to make important decisions. And you're practicing it here in APAMSA. And I think that's where we make the biggest difference. The biggest difference is really with all of you helping one another sort of grow and learn.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like the importance of having that support system, like we talked about earlier, connecting with people who have the same vision and goals, and then honestly just being kind of like an encouragement to one another, I think is really vital, especially when times do get tough and when, things going around the world just seem to be falling apart. There's no better way than to kind of regroup and reconnect, I think, with people who have pretty similar goals in mind. Unfortunately, as we kind of wrap up tonight's session, and I feel like we could go on about everything forever, we had some wrap-up questions that we kind of wanted to ask you about. And so, if you could go back and give your younger self one piece of advice at the start of medical school, what would it be?
It gets better. I think when you first start med school, it's so challenging. I think the thing is, for example, like you think about, like, say, to get to med school, you start off as being, you probably were one of the top students in high school. So then you got to a good college and you're probably one of the top students in college, and now you're in med school. And you know what? Everyone else in med school was a top student in their college. So you can't always be at the top. It's like sort of making your way to the Olympics, And so it could be so stressful. There are a lot of aspects of med school that are so stressful, but it'll be fine. As long as you get past, you pass the boards one way or another, somehow get out of med school, you'll be fine. You'll be fine no matter what happens. Heck, even if you drop out of med school, at least you'll have this experience. I don't encourage you to drop out, by the way, but either case, no matter what happens, you'll be fine and it'll get better one way or another.
That's honestly really encouraging to hear. I think as someone who is still in the earlier years of medical training, that's actually really encouraging. I wanted to also ask you kind of what are your hopes for the next generation of AANHPI physicians?
I think the hopes are that, and it's interesting, I'm also on the board of the National Council of API Physicians, and it's so interesting that within in CAPIP, that there's probably a lot of older physicians, their greatest fear is that the next generation won't care about API communities, that, that they just will, exactly. And, I don't have that fear. I see all of you on this call. I've seen everyone at APAMSA. I know you all care. I mean, I almost feel that your current generation cares more than any other recent generation about activism, about doing right with the community and so forth. So I think my hope is that everyone keeps up with it. I think the one advice I would give is that, or two minor pieces of advice is that don't be too hard on other people with different views. I mean, it's a very divisive time right now where people have very strongly held views about right and wrong. I would say it's important to recognize that people who have views that seem completely 100% wrong to you, give them a little bit of grace, and hope that they do the same for you, that we can always agree on stuff. This is something that's important for being a doctor. As a doctor, you're going to treat all sorts of patients, many of whom, like you really don't know where they're coming from, to be honest. They're so different. But as a physician, you have, it's important to be able to provide care to everyone. So at least be somewhat open-minded. That doesn't mean that you give up on your principles. It's still important to have your principles and your ideas about what you think is important. And number two, it's a tough world out there. There's so many bad things that happen out there. Try not to let that get you down. I think the Dalai Lama, I'm going to paraphrase, I don't know the exact quote. He basically says that don't feel obligated, they have to save the entire world. Just, leave the world in a better place than you found it. Make those incremental improvements where you can. Do your best to alleviate rather than create suffering along the way. And then that you've had a positive impact. So I think these are relevant.
Yeah, I think that's something really important, especially, as you're saying, during these divisive times, to keep in mind is that everyone's always going to have different views. But I think, there's some beauty in learning to respect that and to maybe see it from their perspective too. There's always validity, right, on differing views. And hopefully that can kind of enrich our perspectives in our own lives as well. Here at AMA, we kind of like to wrap up as we start this new season with a new signature type of question. And it's the following. If you could put one lesson from your life or your career on a billboard in every medical school in America, what would it say?
I think the lesson I would probably say is probably like learn from your mistakes, but don't beat yourself up over it. I think that's probably good advice. I've seen in radiology, it's like in radiology, it's impossible not to make mistakes. Like we make mistakes all the time. I shouldn't say that out loud, but I think there's some stats, something like typically radiologists make mistakes 20% of the time, But the key, of course, you don't make any huge mistakes. But, it's human to make mistakes. You want to learn from them. They're learning opportunities. But I've seen radiologists get really, especially when they go through a lawsuit, if they've been sued, they get really gun shy. They become very cautious, and they end up sort of generating reports that are very, very equivocal, that have a lot of not sure about that. It's important not to lose your confidence, because we will all make mistakes, and it's more to keep on going, and not beat yourself up over them.
Right. And I think that's some powerful words to kind of end on. It's that importance in realizing that, we're all still human at the end of the day. We're in a literally life and, kind of life and death type of field where we're kind of, our hands are kind of, just kind of dictating kind of, someone's life. And I think that's a lot of pressure, honestly. And honestly, as growing up in Asian households, right, we're continuously taught and encouraged to not make mistakes. But the reality is that they occur all the time. So it's learning to kind of cope with that, to learn from them, and to continue chugging on. I want to thank everyone, and especially Dr. Lee, for joining us this evening on our first AMA event. We're so happy to get things back up and rolling. Hope you can join us in our next month's session. And thank you again, Dr. Lee.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
And that's our latest installment in the Ask Me Anything series. If you have a specific physician or specialty that you'd love to hear from, let us know. You can reach us at professionaldev@apamsa.org. We hope you enjoyed today's episode as much as we did, and don't forget to tune in next time. Thanks, everyone.